Geoffry Tucker, welcome to our show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Now, we've had 2.5 years of pandemic restrictions, most of which has been vehemently debated among the medical community. In your opinion, how much sooner could the CDC's reversal have come?
The article that they published in the MMWR last week could have been published in the spring of 2020, because there wasn't a word in that document that wasn't true back then. We didn't need to be testing asymptomatic people. We didn't need to be distinguishing between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Natural immunity was always a thing. Quarantine should have applied to the sick, not the whole population, and so on it goes. It's just a little puzzling that they would have put this out. I mean, there never was an exit strategy for the lockdowns and the mandates, and what we're seeing with this new document was an attempt for them to roll back everything that all the unscientific positions they took before, without admitting error, while also encouraging people to go ahead and behave normally, as everybody has been for a very long time.
An untold number of lives have been affected by these restrictions. We've had people losing their jobs to vaccine mandates. We've had kids with learning loss, skyrocketing rates of depression, all sorts of things. How much responsibility do you think the CDC should bear?
Well, I think they deserve an enormous amount of responsibility. I mean, it's complicated because on one hand, they claimed only to be giving recommendations. On the other hand, if you disobeyed their recommendations, there was enforcement there behind it, but it wasn't the CDC doing the enforcement. It was the politicians who in turn said that they were deferring to the CDC and so on. It's like the whole system is constructed to avoid responsibility, so it's just this round robin, who's to blame kind of thing, and nobody's stepping up to take responsibility. So I suppose in some sense that there's plenty of responsibility to go around, the administrative state, the courts that didn't intervene, the politicians that acquiesced, and there was quite a lot of subterfuge involved in the entire thing. So there's many layers of deception and unscientific thinking here, and it's very frustrating because the truth is that people are really crying out for answers. As you mentioned, there's a lot of suffering, economic suffering and cultural and educational losses, and churches have been destroyed, more than 100,000 small businesses and so on. You would think that after all this there would be somebody that stood up and said, okay, we made a mistake, but nobody's done that yet.
And with that in mind, what would accountability look like here?
Well, I think we need the information out. And we're going to have so many questions, so that has to start at least with some hearings. And then, I don't know, the justice is a very difficult thing because nothing can take away the people's sufferings, the number of people who had to die alone, the funerals that have never attended, the 2 years of educational losses. So there's nothing that can happen can make up for this. But at the very least, we need a system in place that prevents anything like this from happening again. But instead of that, we're getting the opposite, which is a construction of an apparatus that's even going to be more ferocious the next time. This is the most troubling aspect.
And we're getting more outbreaks with other diseases and more emergency declarations as well. So looking forward, how do you think the U.S. should deal with these outbreaks?
Well, we need to recognize that once the pathogen comes along, the pathogen doesn't go away, especially if it's a coronavirus, respiratory virus. The virus is never going to go away. They kept telling us to slow the spread, which really just amounted to prolonging the pain. And now it's going to become endemic, which is to say that our immune systems have to adapt to it. So the correct policy is the one that we had been using for 100 years, in 1941 through 44, in 1929 with the parrot flu, and 68, 69 with the Asian flu, and 57, 58 with Hong Kong flu, and so on, to 2013, and going all the way back, which is to say that you protect the vulnerable, you build up herd immunity in the population through a scaling up of immune systems and trusting natural immunity, which is the way that we're getting out of this pandemic, through natural immunity. The vaccines were leaky, to say the best, and certainly in most cases the harms of them outweighed their benefits. If there were any benefit that lasted longer than 3 months, we don't even know that. So we need to go back to traditional standards of public health that we had in place as recently as 2019. That's the lesson here. Don't let crazy scientists be in charge of taking over society in the event of a pathogenic spread. Just don't do it. And I'm just not sure if that's the lesson that we're taking away here.
And the CDC didn't follow the Great Barrington Declaration, but you're saying that now they are. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So the Great Barrington Declaration said what I just said. The virus has to become endemic. You need to disrupt society as little as possible. Rely on herd immunity strategies to, not strategies, but on the reality of herd immunity to protect the vulnerable and move on with life. That's the way traditional public health dealt with it. And that seems to be more or less what CDC is saying now, which is more or less what the Great Barrington Declaration said on October 4th, 2020. And, it's just remarkable because when that document came out, you had the head of NIH writing to Anthony Fauci. This is Francis Collins writing to Anthony Fauci saying, we need to do a quick and hard takedown, just devastating takedown were his actual words, of the Great Barrington Declaration. And so they did. They assigned their reporters and commenced the smears and that sort of thing. And here we are 2.5 years later, 2 years later, and everybody recognizes that the Great Barrington Declaration was correct all along. I would just like some honesty. That's, you asked earlier about, what does justice look like? I think justice has to begin with truth.
Geoffry Tucker from Brownstone Institute, thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.